President Yoon Suk Yeol makes a second appearance at the Constitutional Court on this Thursday for his impeachment trial. On Press Perspective today, we continue our talk with members of the foreign media about the president's fate and more. Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Press Perspective. It's Thursday, January 23rd here in Seoul, and I'm Min Sunhee. While President Yoon Suk Yeol remains reluctant to cooperate in the investigation led by relevant officials, he appears quite dedicated to the impeachment case against him at the Constitutional Court. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with the news agency UPI. Thomas, it's great to have you back.
Thanks, great to be here.
I also have freelance journalist Raphael Rashid with us. Raphael, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Thomas, we will start with you. Now, you've been covering the president's attendance at the impeachment trial over at the Constitutional Court. What has been the gist of your coverage thus far?
Yeah, just basically covering sort of what's happening inside and outside. I mean, inside I wasn't in the courtroom, but it's being broadcast live, and just covering on Tuesday, covering Yoon's initial testimony, which was interesting. I mean, we're seeing what position he's taking in terms of the defense, and basically, one of the big takeaways was he denied ordering the military to go in and pull the National Assembly members out during the martial law vote, which kind of contradicts claims that his chief of the Army Special Warfare Command made last month, saying that Yoon did tell him to break down the door and remove the lawmakers. And basically Yoon was saying that he had no real power to overcome the vote of the National Assembly. Was more framing it as this was an exercise or a way to send an alarm about what was going on in the government, the Democratic Party sort of gumming up the works and paralyzing the government. So this was sort of a way of sending a message more than saying, I really thought we were going to get away with it. That seems to be kind of the stance he's taking. That's sort of what the legal team is also emphasizing. And he also leaned in again to these allegations, unfounded allegations of election fraud, which as kind of being used as a justification for declaring martial law, and that leads to the outside scene, which was the rally, all around the Constitutional Court was a huge rally of his supporters, which we've been seeing for a couple of weeks now. And, that's really the message that they've been amplifying, these charges of election fraud. We're seeing Stop the Steal signs, which are kind of being borrowed from the MAGA Trump movement. And, it didn't get violent, but there is a sense of volatility there. There's a sense of hostility there. I mean, certainly people are in the faces of the police. I mean, there was a huge police presence, something like 4,000 officers, barricades all the way around. But, it got tense, and there was definitely, there's a real sense of anger that's growing. I mean, there were calls to execute Lee Jae-myung, with the opposition leader, and execute the chief prosecutor of the case. So there's a real, a sense of volatility and hostility growing outside, and that's kind of the two tracks of what's happening with this whole impeachment saga right now.
Right, and before we delve further into that, Raphael, separately, anti-corruption investigators, they've had little success in questioning President Yoon over his abuse of power, which is why they earlier this morning announced a decision to hand over the investigation to prosecutors. Meanwhile, what has been the focus of the foreign media with regard to the ongoing investigation into insurrection charges against the president?
Yeah, I mean, let's look at what's been going on over the past few days. The CIO, the anti-corruption agency, their attempts to question President Yoon have been unsuccessful and have led to an unprecedented standoff. And after his arrest on January 15th, he underwent one initial questioning session, although, as I understand, he didn't reveal much within that session, and he has repeatedly refused to comply with the CIO. In recent days, they also tried their first attempt in South Korean history to forcibly summon him, basically going to the detention center, trying to question him. Again, that ended, unsuccessfully. Yoon's team has maintained the CIO has no right to kind of investigate these insurrection charges, which has led to, as you said, the CIO referring the case to the prosecutors this morning. But I think international media themselves have largely focused on the broader implications rather than these day-to-day, hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute developments. The key points they're drawing attention to are, I think, the historic nature of Yoon's arrest, the first in history for a sitting president in this country, and of course the serious nature of the allegations of insurrection after the martial law declaration. So I think there's this particular interest in how South Korea's democratic institutions are handling this case. Of course, the investigation itself is centering on, again, whether he incited violence with the goal of subverting the constitution when he ordered the troops to storm into the National Assembly on that night, on December 3rd. So I think now that the case is going to the prosecutors, there's going to be a bit more momentum or interest in international media, because I think this is a significant development. So we'll probably see a lot more interest over the coming days, if not weeks.
Right. Raphael, you covered the violence by rioters at the Seoul Western District Court in the very early hours of Sunday following the court's decision to formally extend the president's detention. Tell us a bit about your coverage.
Yeah, I mean, the scene outside the court at the weekend, I think, marked a disturbing escalation in this political crisis. About 90 protesters, mainly supporting President Yoon, they broke into the courthouse. Essentially, some of them were trying to hunt down the judge who had issued the warrant for Yoon's extended detention. They used fire extinguishers, steel pipes. They even used the police shields that they had grabbed from the police to try and break their way in, causing damage of an estimate 600 to 700 million won, which is about $500,000. The violence left around 50 police officers injured, some of them very seriously, and media were also, broadcast media were also attacked that day and had their equipment damaged. The police has formed a special investigation team to deal with this sternly, as they say, and among 90 people that were apprehended on the day, there have been around 50 arrest warrants that have been issued by a court, and many of these are actually young people in their 20s and 30s who were arrested on the day, some of them YouTubers showing their way around in the courthouse. I think what's maybe quite notable at the moment, as we're getting more updates over the past few days, is how some of these people involved were from far-right religious groups. One of the suspects that tried to go hunt down the judge was reportedly identified as a special evangelist from a controversial far-right religious group. And we've seen civil society groups that have filed criminal complaints against the leader of this controversial church, saying that he is the reason for the violence and he incited it. So I think over the coming days, many questions will be asked about where did this violence come from, this riot? Was it out of the blue or was it incited? And I think there are many parallels to be drawn with this case, this riot, and what we saw in the US 4 years ago on January 6th when there was the riot at Capitol Hill.
Right, and that being said, Thomas, speaking as an American journalist, what are your takeaways with regard to the parallels being drawn, as Raphael mentioned, between the 2021 US Capitol riots and Sunday's riots by pro-Yoon supporters here in the country?
It's hard not to see the parallels, just the optics of it, the mechanics of it, as Raphael described, these angry mob of supporters supporting a president, storming into a government facility, attacking police, destroying property, wandering the halls and chanting for someone to come out. And January 6th, they were chanting for Mike Pence, the vice president, Nancy Pelosi. The driven in large part by the same kind of online generated far-right conspiracies that animated a lot of the January 6 rioters. And we've already seen there's an affinity and affiliation for these groups of Yoon supporters and the MAGA movement in the U.S. So I mean, there are definitely a lot of parallels. Whether it was directly inspired, I mean, it's hard to say. But I think more than that, it's the acting president Che called this unimaginable in a democracy. But I think actually this has become very imaginable. And seeing January 6th, it sort of has moved the window of what is possible or what is even conceivable. I mean, it was so shocking when that happened, and then somehow it becomes less and less so, and not to say normalized, but it becomes something that is conceivable. And I think that if it's not really sternly responded to quickly, then it becomes something that just exists as a possibility that people might not have imagined before. So there's a lot of similarities. I mean, there's of course differences. The scale and the sort of function of what they were after in the U.S. They were trying to impede the legislative body, whereas here it was impeding the justice system, and it was obviously a smaller scale. But I think a big difference that we're seeing is that Yoon is already facing consequences for his martial law declaration, and he's in custody and he's facing trial, and Trump never did face the consequences of his involvement with involvement in the January 6th riots. I mean, a lot of January 6th participants did end up getting arrested, but now we've seen they've actually been pardoned by Trump. So there's a question of this accountability. Here, there's still an opportunity for accountability to be imposed, whereas in the U.S. we've seen kind of the opposite of that basically happening. So there's a difference and there's a possibility. I mean, we'll have to see how this ends up, but Korea does have a chance to send a message that this kind of behavior is not tolerable in a democracy.
Thomas, speaking about sending a message, as you mentioned, Mr. Trump earlier this week pardoned the January 6th rioters. What has been the response to that move?
I think it was expected, but the scope of it is kind of shocking, because he pardoned everyone across the board. I mean, even a month ago, Trump had kind of been mentioning it and sort of, seemed to carve out an exception for what he called like the radical, crazy ones. And Vice President Vance had said, something like, of course, it would only be the people that protested peacefully, not the violent ones. But Trump went ahead and pardoned, it was almost 1,600. And so a lot of them, were people that had been arrested for trespassing or damaging property. Some of them were just, misdemeanor type of charges. But there was around 600 that were convicted of either assaulting or resisting or obstructing police, and among those, 175 roughly were charged with, deadly violence or assault with dangerous weapons, and some of these were people assaulting policemen with fire extinguishers, flag poles, using tasers, bear spray. So and a lot of them had significant prison terms, 5 years, 10 years, and they were freed. And then Trump also commuted the sentences of a number of, they were mainly members of these militias like the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, that had been convicted of seditious conspiracy, and some of them had very long sentences. Enrique Tarrio, who's the kind of head of one of the Proud Boys, had a 22-year sentence. Another head of the Oath Keepers had an 18-year sentence. So those were also, they weren't pardoned, but they were totally commuted. So I think, amidst a whole range of sort of expected but shocking in how vast and dramatic the moves that Trump has been making in just the first couple of days. I mean, this was along those lines. So it was, expected, but more than people I think had really anticipated. Right.
Meanwhile, back here in the country, Raphael, along with the concerns covered by the foreign media, given the country's political turmoil, quite a number of international media have also continued to commend the Korean people for protecting democracy. Speaking within your capacity as a journalist based here, what are your takeaways?
Yeah, I think, of course, what happened on the night of December 3rd has been quite shocking for everyone involved. But a lot of foreign media have been commending the role of the Korean people in protecting democracy, and in a powerful analysis that was published in The Guardian just recently, an expert highlighted how South Korea's democratic institutions were preserved, and the remarkable resilience during this crisis. And when President Yoon declared martial law on December 3rd, the parliament worked very swiftly with nationwide support from the citizens who still carry traumatic memories of authoritarian regimes and governments of the past, and that kind of state of violence. And when I was outside the parliament on that day, what I did find remarkable was how quickly citizens were already there, well before the politicians arrived. And from my own reporting over the past a week and a half, speaking with lawmakers of the opposition party, I think one thing that they are emphasizing is how the citizens were there, and many lawmakers who had to go across the fences to go into the main hall of the National Assembly, they say that in order to get into the main hall, it was their staff and their secretaries that were waiting outside the doors, blocking it so that the military could not come in, and basically forming a human barricade in a way. And some of them say, looking back, that their staff, their secretaries, essentially risked their lives, put their lives on the line to protect the lawmakers inside in order for them to vote to nullify the martial law. So there was also another article in The Guardian. The editorial board actually published an article, and they added, of course, that South Korean presidencies have usually ended badly with leaders being assassinated, ousted, or impeached, but that the events demonstrated both the strengths and ongoing challenges of Korean democracy. And while the reluctance of Yoon's party, his colleagues in the People Power Party for initially backing they had a lot of reluctance to back the impeachment. The paper noted that underlying all of this remains a strong sense of democracy that Koreans feel within themselves. So I think what's clear is how institutions maintained restraint during this martial law crisis, during these tense times, and I think it speaks volumes about the democratic values that Korean people have embedded within themselves, and I think that spirit was definitely on show on the night, but also over the past few weeks up until today.
All right. Perhaps staying with what Raphael has just said, Thomas, the words of wisdom are democracy is a work in progress and not of progress. So do you suppose Korea is indeed witnessing these words in action as we speak?
Absolutely. I think all democracies sort of operate under that principle. Another phrase I've heard is democracy is a verb. This idea that it's not something you just kind of set and then it works on its own. You have to be active and participate. And I think it is interesting to see how this is playing out in South Korea, which is such a young democracy. And as Raphael mentioned, so many people have active memories of the struggle for democracy and what life under martial law was like. And I think some of that era still carries over into today. I mean, the 1980s, a lot of powerful coalitions were formed of labor unions and student groups, and there still is that ability, I think, to mobilize very quickly. And we saw that, as Raphael mentioned, almost immediately at the night of the martial law decree, which was surprising to me too, how swiftly. And I think that is just something that's kind of embedded in the society and still exists from those days of the democracy struggle, these networks. And so that's been fascinating to watch. And I think, as well, that it really is a question of the institutions, not just, democracy as in going to cast your ballot, but the independence of the judiciary, the media's ability to report freely. And, we have seen those hold for the most part, this time around, and seeing kind of a sense of accountability. I was going to say, we're talking about things that were imaginable before, seeing the January 6th rioters, but, something like, and this has happened in the past, the president, it's not great to keep impeaching presidents, throwing presidents in jail, but at the same time, it becomes something that is imaginable, is possible. People can envision a president being prosecuted, being held to account for corruption or doing things that are undermining the democracy. So I think that's something that is powerful that still exists in South Korean democracy. And sometimes, comparing it to the US, I feel like, we're seeing the US going through a lot of struggles now. And just globally, I think democracy is kind of in a challenging period and backsliding in a lot of countries. So it's not just, the young democracies that are a work in progress. It really is something that has to be kind of reapproached and change. That's the strength of democracy too, is that it can adapt to changing circumstances. Even now with this case with Yoon, we're seeing something like the anti-corruption organization that's investigating him and recommending charges. They've only existed for 4 years, basically. So they're kind of a response to something that has happened in the past. So we're seeing this evolution of Korean democracy. And, so far it has been, I think, a model of maintaining those values during a challenging time. We'll see how this all plays out, but there's definitely a lot to kind of take away from this.
Right, and as we wait for this to play out, Raphael, there are scholars here in the country who fear that the latest political unrest may negatively affect the country's credibility, reliability on the international stage. Do you suppose this is a valid concern?
Difficult question, but I think initially the shock among even diplomatic circles here was palpable when a democratically elected president suddenly declares martial law. And I think that concern has probably deepened with the subsequent arrest under insurrection charges. So I think it's a valid concern that these events could maybe affect South Korea's credibility, though the impact of this largely depends on how the situation is going to be managed going forward over the next few weeks. Hopefully it won't drag on for too long. At the end of the day, South Korea has built an extremely strong reputation, not only in the world, but around the world as a thriving democracy and a reliable economic partner. So I think if things are not resolved, maybe investor confidence could waver and, credibility, diplomatic credibility could be affected. So there's also economic dimension. South Korea has, an extremely important role in global technology supply chains. All that being said, South Korea has weathered political crises before, lest we forget 2017 when President Park Geun-hye was impeached, and at the time they said there was a lot of turmoil and what's going to happen to Korea. But I think overall South Korea did not suffer too much long-term damage because of that. So yes, there are concerns, but I think they are limited for the time being, and people are being cautious but also optimistic that the situation will hopefully be resolved quickly.
All right, fingers crossed for that. And on that cautious optimism, we'll end today. Raphael, as always, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you very much.
And Thomas, thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, well, on that note, we say goodbye for today. We return same time tomorrow, that is Friday, with a look at the broader social issues.